The motion picture of the day is one all about an alcoholic. An alcoholic. A man who can't stop pouring his favorite beverage down his throat. He takes it too far and just can't stop imbibing. Although one way he might have helped his own cause would have been to switch to some other liquid gold. Can I suggest, coffee? Well, of course I can. It's my podcast. And I will also suggest you brew with the best and try a company that will sell you premium quality beans, the best you have ever made, in fact. And that's Sparkplug Coffee. Sparkplug is all about convenience and affordability. Look, kids, their stuff is so much better and cheaper than takeout. And they deliver it right to your door. Americans, yeah, you can get in on this, and that's great, but we Canadians get free shipping. And hey, movie stars caught up in difficult marriages, you should join the Autopilot Coffee Club. Well, everyone should, not just movie stars. You can pause or cancel anytime, and the way to do that is to go to sparkplug.coffee. Tack on /HYES to that address, and you can score a one-time 20% discount. Find your new favorite from Sparkplug Coffee. Okay, I think the time has come for the birthing of a star. Judy and James, you're up. And action. Have you ever seen A Star is Born? Happy day, one and all, and thank you for adding the 625th dose of Have You Ever Seen Podcasting Mania to your busy day. It's just mania. Glad to have you. This is a classic movies podcast that spoils all the twists and turns in the film we're talking about, and sometimes others, which we do every Monday and every other Friday. Since it is a Friday, you've got only me, Ryan Ellis, the man who never had much of a career to feel sad about losing. My wife Bev is never here on days with the word fry in them, but she will be on the pod again on Monday. Before I get into anything about the 1954 A Star is Born, I should tell you that we already covered Bradley Cooper's 2018 take on this subject matter nearly 2 years ago. Bev wasn't very interested in talking about this one too, which is why I'm doing this extravaganza alone, but I let the AFI's top 100 lists guide my hand a lot of the time. You probably know that, especially this year. And this was on a lot of AFI lists. Plus, it's a beloved classic, and we haven't talked about Judy Garland or James Mason all that much over the years. Look, I'm trying to find ways to justify doing this because this was not my favorite movie experience. Not even close. It's not awful, it's just overrated. But we'll get to all that. Let's tee this thing up. What have we got? Well, A Star is Born for the second of 4 times was released by Warner Brothers 70 years ago in October of 1954. The film cost a lot to make, so even a pretty impressive box office haul wasn't enough to offset how much Warner's sunk in to make it. Shooting in CinemaScope, which was a new process at the time, and having to deal with Judy Garland's unreliability were 2 big reasons that the cost soared so much. To give a quick synopsis, I can tell you that George Cukor directed the film, Mr. Cukor, while Moss Hart wrote it, basing the story on the 1937 movie's story and screenplay. James Mason plays Norman Maine, Judy Garland plays Vicky Lester, although her character's real name is Esther Blodgett. She's a young ingenue and a singer whose star rises meteorically after Norma makes a mission of shepherding her career. Meanwhile, he fades, partly because he's a serious alcoholic. And who needs a funny alcoholic? You ought to be serious about such things. Anyway, they're in love and they get married, but he's dragging her down and he knows it, so he goes and does something about that, and it isn't a happy ending. Or, in a nutshell, a star is bombed, and Norma Maine often is in this movie. Let's talk Rotten Tomatoes for all the editions of this classic story. This version of The Star is killer. It's at 98% from the critics and 81% from the audiences. 43 out of 44 critics have thumbed it up, and their average is 8.1 out of 10. The Streisand and Christopherson one in 1976, however, is a great big splat. It's only at 37%. The 1937 one, directed by William Wellman, and Cooper's 2018 take on it, have all kinds of critics saying all kinds of nice things about them. The 1937 edition has nothing but fresh tomatoes. It's at 100%, and Cooper and Gaga's take on it is at 90%. Judy and James's 1954 motion picture was nominated for 6 Oscars, although Best Picture was not one of them. Of course, Rear Window was not for Best Picture that year either, and that's a bigger omission, far worse in my opinion. James Mason was up for Best Actor, and Judy Garland was a nominee for Best Actress. Many thought she especially was a shoo-in. For one thing, she had never won before, and sometimes people's names get called because enough voters just think their time has come. Garland never would win a competitive Oscar, though. Grace Kelly was the winner in 1954 for The Country Girl. Judy wasn't even at the ceremony anyway. She was in the hospital giving birth to her son, Joey. Joey. Come to Philly, Joey. And I said this was her best chance to win a trophy, but we can't forget that they did give her a juvenile Oscar in 1940 which wasn't specifically for The Wizard of Oz, but they did give it to her at that same year's Oscars. Incidentally, in 3 of the 4 versions of A Star is Born, both stars were nominated for Oscars, in leading categories, of course. Both Janet Gaynor and Frederick March in 1937, both Garland and Mason in 1954, and both Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper in 2018. Neither Streisand nor Christopherson were up for their acting in the 1976 one, but Babs did win for that song called Evergreen, and she'd won Best Actress before anyway in 1968, was it, for Funny Girl? The other 4 nominations for A Star is Born were for Ray Heindorf's music score, the costume design, the sets, and the classic song, The Man That Got Away. I gotta say, it's a good tune, and it has real relevance to the plot. It's used many times. It's not just in the end credits and has no real bearing on anything. I always hate when songs like that are nominated or win, even if it's a good song. The title song from 3 Coins in a Fountain won for Best Song, though, that year. And Mason's other big movie that year, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, beat out this, and obviously 3 other movies for the sets. I guess that great big submarine was more impressive to voters than nightclubs and rich people's houses. Congress inducted George Cukor's Flicker Show into the National Film Registry in 2000. I think his name is pronounced Cukor, as in cucumber, but then you go with the or instead of umber. Others that went in that year were Apocalypse Now, the 1931 Dracula, Goodfellas, which was in its first year of eligibility. Not a lot of movies have gotten in on their first year. Fargo did, and I think Toy Story did too. Toy Story, the first one, did also. Little Caesar, Network, and Shaft were 3 others that went in 2000 to the National Film Registry. All 6 of those projects have been talked about on this channel at some point or another. But here's the clincher for why I decided to cover this one today. Well, okay, availability always helps. I was able to record it off TCM, and I knew they would have a good print of it in all of its Technicolor glory. But yeah, the real clincher is that this movie is a bonanza of American Film Institute goodness. They have it on 3 lists. It was 43rd on the Top 100 Passions, 11th on the Top 100 Songs with The Man That Got Away, and 7th on the Top 25 Musicals. The AFI also nominated that sterling line, "Hello everybody, this is Mrs. Norman Maine," for the Top 100 quotes. Who isn't quoting that at least every other day? Maybe every 3rd day. Plus the film was up for the 1998 and 2007 AFI Top 100 lists. So this could have been on our podcast a long time ago. We could have covered it back in 98. No, not 98. We started doing this in 2013. But it did not make it, obviously. Okay, that's proof that many human beings think this is a fantastic Flicker show. Let's piece through it, and I'll tell you what I think. After some jaunty opening credits, George Cukor starts with shots of the outside of the Shrine Auditorium in jolly old Los Angeles. Although this event isn't the Oscars, as I thought it was, I guess the stars are out to see a variety of performances, from ballet to some big banding. For all this opening, Cukor and his team blended real footage of either a big movie premiere or the Oscars or something epic with their own material of the actors in this movie. And their extras, of course, too. You could tell when it's stock footage and when it's the ginned up stuff they shot for their movie because it just doesn't look the same. Cukor stuff is far crisper and just looks a lot better. I'm guessing actually the documentary type footage is probably in 16, isn't it? Or what would the film format be back then? It's not 35. It just looks different. Norman Maine is one of the stars expected to show up that night, but he's late because he was off tipping a few. More than a few. When Norman does show up, he goofs around with the dancers because he's too drunk to be a professional, or to just take his seat and watch the show. He's also in pal-around mode backstage with Jack Carson's publicist character, Matt Libby. Well, for now. But then gets mad over something minor and pushes the big guy into a mirror hard enough to break it. It was him he pushed, right? Because I was looking down to write some of this stuff when I saw him push a guy. I think it was Jack Carson. Esther isn't known as Vicky yet, so Esther is there to perform as a singer with the Glenn Williams Band. She's a little bit starstruck to see the big movie star backstage, although she's no fool. She can tell, like everyone else can, that he's blitzed. It's funny because right from the start it seems like Judy Garland is playing more sympathetic to him, I guess. Almost like he's more her son. Am I right about that? Do you have that take also? Their meet cute happens when he stumbles on stage and nearly interrupts her performance with 2 other guys, but she smartly just incorporates them into the dancing. You gotta meet, and you gotta do it cute. So it almost seems like Norm's goofing was supposed to happen. Right from the start, Esther does her best to save Norman from making things even worse than he's already making them. Backstage afterwards, they make the introduction. He's into her, but she politely brushes him off. She's interested, sure, but I bet she realizes that if she indulges this, she's going to end up in bed with him. You'd hope willingly, but maybe not. I could have been projecting that. I just got that feeling that she thought, I maybe shouldn't indulge this at all other than being polite. He does end up in bed that night, but alone. While he's passed out between the sheets, we learn that Matt Libby is not a fan of this guy's never-ending antics and having to cover for yet another drunken outburst, something he's often having to do. Norman tracks down Esther in a small club where she's rehearsing with her band. We get the Man That Got Away song already, only about 20 minutes into this thing, and she's Judy Garland, so you know she's phenomenal at singing this tune. I was surprised that Cukor didn't really cut away from her to show Norman visibly falling for her. The camera mostly just stays on her belting out this number. No moony-eyed reaction shots. It's not really even a very big production. It's just them performing the song. Pretty simple, not even the best lighting or anything like that. It's fine lighting, but it's not some big grand thing. Maybe that's what Garland insisted on, similar to how simple Over the Rainbow is in Wizard of Oz. They don't cut away to anything else in that immortal song either. No one's really watching her in that. In this, of course, he is. I'm just surprised they didn't show his face going, ah, sigh. Or if they did, it wasn't often. She's shy to talk about herself while he's driving her home, but I like that Norman does actually let her talk. I guess when you're into somebody like this, you want to hear everything they have to say. I haven't always been the best listener, so kudos to the character and the actor in this scene. She invites him into her place to look at a scrapbook or something. Then he up and decides that she needs to quit Glenn's band and he will get her a job at his studio. Then she'll be an actress, not just a singer. She's going to do both. Normie even says, and I can't do this like Bill Hader, but don't settle for the little dream. Go on with the big one. Good line. Later that night, Norman calls the studio head Oliver Niles, that's the Charles Bickford character, to tell him about this new young talent he's discovered, while she goes up to her bandmate Danny's room and tells him that she's not going to San Francisco with the band. I guess what convinced her was when Norm looked at her potential in a way that even she didn't think was there. She simply has to find out if the movie star's hunch is bang on or bang off. The next morning when Norman is hungover and Esther is saying goodbye to the band, we get our first instance of Warner Brothers using still frames to cover for some missing shots. After they cut a lot of scenes out in '54, I guess the cut footage was lost forever. Using still shots was their compensation when they restored the flick to its original 3-hour length, which they did in the early 80s, and I read that Cukor just missed seeing the final proper version on the big screen. I think he died right before that happened. The audio is fine, incidentally, so you can hear what the actors are saying, but sepia-tone stills are interspersed with the film proper. I think they did this with the Capra film Lost Horizon too, and for the same reason. The negative was unusable, but the sound worked, so they settled. And they do it more often the next half hour or so than I remembered when I first saw this, which was probably 25 years ago. And I find it distracting. I somewhat tuned out for this stretch of the film. Anyway, Norman gets so blotto that he ends up being unable to work and to stay in her life. She does have a chance to go back on the road with Danny and the band, but she wants to make this acting business work for her, so she gets a job as a car hop at a fast food restaurant. So many people have done this, right? They've waited tables, they've taken crappy jobs, and tried to make it in show business. She also gets a gig singing for a commercial, and Norman recognizes her voice when he hears it on the TV, so he tracks her down again. He's not going to let her be the woman that got away. Not a second time. And as such, she's about to finally get that screen test, but the makeup guys scrutinize her so much that they mess with her confidence. Her face is supposedly awful. One guy thinks her nose is the problem. Another says it's the eyebrows. I don't want to be unfair to one of the great stars of the 20th century, but it's not like Judy got famous for her looks. She was cute and very appealing, but she was never a great beauty. Trouble is, they overdo it when they glob on so much makeup and put an unflattering blonde wig on her. Do not glob makeup. Is that a word? I think it is. Globbing. Now she looks terrible, which I suppose is the point of this scene. It was moderately funny. She looks so wrong that Norman doesn't even recognize her when he passes by, not until he hears her voice. And he's not even blind drunk this time. She just looks that different. He makes her undo all that the makeup guys did. When Mr. Maine is done with her, though, she looks so much better because she looks like herself. Although it's funny to put it that way because the character and the actress herself is wearing plenty of makeup in this movie, so she's not really being herself. Anyway, Esther tracks down Matt and then Oliver on the studio lot. They're polite enough, but they basically brush her off since she's only there as a favor to their big movie star Norman. And they're busy guys. It's not like they're saying, get out of my face, I have nothing else to do, but I don't want to talk to you anyway. They do give her a shot, though. She gets a few small roles, although she doesn't even get to show her face in one scene set in a train. She even gets chewed out by the director for moving close enough to the window, and her face is seen on camera. He does not want her face on camera. Ironic, because she's going to be such a star, and what you want more than anything else from a star is to have their face on camera. Libby had said they'd find the new name for her by the end of the week, and it ends up being, drumroll please, I'm not going to do a drumroll, Vicky Lester. She only finds that out when she goes to get her first paycheck. She's not thrilled about being Vicky for about 9 seconds, then accepts it and quickly seems to like their choice. At least they incorporated her real first name into her fake last name. Maybe Hollywood would call me Nolan Ryan or something. Reynolds Ryan. They already have one of those guys, don't they? And, of course, not show business, but baseball has a Nolan Ryan. During a meeting with Norman, Oliver hears a recording of Vicky's The Man That Got Away, and he's hooked, deciding to cast her in one of their big-budget musicals. And this whole thing was set up by Norman for the express purpose of his boss hearing the song and getting hooked on her voice. The still frame replacement thing is back in the scene that follows this one, but only for a few shots. I get why they did this, but I didn't love it. I'm also the guy, or one of the people, who generally doesn't like director's cuts or revamped movies. What you made was what you made. Revising history by putting out different versions of a movie almost always feels a little cheap to me. So yeah, they wanted their 3-hour cut, the original cut, but you did this? In any case, the premiere of Vicky's musical goes great. Things get meta here because Judy Garland is in a musical by being in A Star is Born, and in the scene, her character is an actress in a musical. I never thought she and her daughter Liza Minnelli were spitting images of each other. Maybe other people do, but I didn't. But they come pretty close to that spitting image thing during this sequence. I can also see how this movie is 3 hours long. I know it's a musical, and they want one of the greatest singers of all time to belt out a whole whack of songs. But this Born in a Trunk sequence goes on forever. Since I was trying to get this movie watched before dinner and was tight for time as it was, I was tempted to do something I never do. Fast forward this tomfoolery until they got back to the story. There's the tomfoolery. Were you waiting for it? Probably not. They would say this sequence is the story, but I don't agree. They make the point, and then they keep on making it. We just need to know she's going to succeed. We don't need all they give us here. In fact, this was reminding me way too much of my least favorite part of Singin' in the Rain, the very long "gotta dance" thing near the end. It's still one of my absolute favorite movies, but the last time I watched Singin' in the Rain, I was in a bit of a rush to finish it, so I literally skipped over "gotta dance." I'm known for tangents. Let's tangent right now. Is this even a musical the way that Wizard of Oz or Singin' in the Rain are, which are movies where the characters regularly break into song? Well, no, this is more of a musical in the Nashville sense. Because while there's a lot of singing, it's not like Vicky and Norman are just at home together and they just break into song. He never sings at all, does he? I don't think so. Does anyone else other than Garland? She sings a lot, yes, but it's in context, usually on stage or on a film set, or when she's at home with him that time, but she's still performing like she's on a stage. So I have to question a little why this is so high on AFI's top 25 musicals. I wouldn't put it on there at all. I was writing that last bit there about what kind of musical this is while this interminable scene was playing out, then looked up and saw blackface, right? I did see that, didn't I? I guess they were still doing that in 54. She is singing that Mammy song that Al Jolson belts out in The Jazz Singer, and we know he does blackface in that movie. Of course, that was a quarter of a century earlier. That's the excuse they could use. In any case, after this Born in a Trunk stuff finally ends, the movie goes to intermission. I find it quaint when they leave that card on the screen for the DVD or when it's shown on TCM, like I watched it, since no one watching this at home needs that. They can pause anytime they want if they need to go to the washroom or get a snack. Important people swarm around Vicky after the show, which is shorthand to show us that she's going to be a real somebody. I could have been somebody instead of a bum, a car hop, which is what I am. That was the same year as this, wasn't it? Norman's thrilled for her, but he also tries to give her the brush off. She tells him she loves him, but he's wise enough to know who he is, saying, "I destroy everything I touch." I won't do the accent. "I destroy everything I touch," and he wants her to save herself from him ruining her life. But she kisses him, and if you know anything about the Star is Born arc, you'll know she's too in love to do the sensible thing and steer very clear of this self-destructive drunk. It's funny, though, that Mason hasn't played, I think, any scene drunk since that first one. Certainly not like he did then. We see him sipping sometimes, and they talk about how he ended up unable to work because of his addiction. But most of the time we see him on screen, he's either sober, or at least not all that much in the bag. Although I'm always the one saying that somebody having a drink in their hand is often a movie shorthand, language for he's a drunk or she's a drunk. But contrast that to the way Bradley Cooper plays Mr. Maine in his movie, Jackson Maine in his case. He's always at least somewhat in the bag. Maybe 3 exceptions in a 2-hour and 20-minute movie. Although, all shapes and sizes, I guess. Different people do handle alcohol differently, and of course Cooper is doing drugs too, which I don't think Norman's doing at all in this. You could argue that Norman in the 54 movie is a binge drinker and just does it maybe here and there, but when he drinks, it's a lot, while Jackson Maine in the 2018 movie is just consistently under the influence all the time. Vicky uses her clout to hire her old band to work with her, which is nice. I can only assume they owe this opportunity entirely to her, that they're in this situation at all. Norman proposes while she's rehearsing with Danny and the gang. She accepts, and Oliver's floored. He doesn't want his fading star to mess up his new one, although Matt seems even more worried about this than Ollie does. But at least they can take advantage of the publicity and promote the wedding even bigger than they do their movies. By the way, I thought things were going in a bad way when Norman's proposal was surreptitiously recorded, and then the sound guys played it back for everyone in the recording studio to hear. They're sitting off to the side, everyone else is doing something. You can't hear it at the time. Pretty clever way they did this, actually. They record it and play it back for all to hear. Then we hear what he said to her, and she doesn't really take him seriously. It's actually a little bit embarrassing. I figured that was going to humiliate Normie Norm into going on a bender. I've seen this before, but I don't remember some of the twists and turns and little parts of it. Instead, he just laughs along with the joke they're trying to make of him, since she didn't exactly weep with joy once he popped the question. Matt does make big plans for their nuptials, but cut to them getting married at a simple justice of the peace with only a few witnesses. We find out here that Norman's real name is Ernest Gubbins, which means the studio changed his name too. Or maybe he did, I guess. And you know what? And you know what? I think Ernie Gubbins has a nice ring to it. Big Ern. Anyway, the always irritable Libby drives up and finds them only after the ceremony is done. I've often disliked Jack Carson in what I call his grinning idiot roles, but I actually like how gruff he is in this film. He might be a dick, but he's got his reasons not to be the president of the Norman Maine fan club, or even the vice president, or the treasurer. Once the newlyweds drive off, he unloads his frustrations on Danny, who was a witness at the Gubbins-Blodgett affair. Matt even calls Norman a cruddy actor. He's cheesed off that he's had to spend 10 years covering for and making excuses for this guy. But the couple doesn't care because they're freshly married. Norman asks his new wife to sing to him on their wedding night. We haven't had a song in about 3 minutes, so she does. And as so often happens in musicals, because they usually pre-record the songs, it's immediately obvious she's not in the same room as the scene is set. The sound is richer because it was in a perfect sound booth. Movie sets have good sound, especially from a big budget production like this, but not as great as what you'll get in a recording booth. Although I'm not complaining about the song. Judy Garland sang it. Of course it's good. But things aren't going great in Norman's career. He learns just how bad it is from Oliver, who tells him that the money men want to buy out his contract. He's too big of a risk, what with all the missed production time because he's often unavailable to work. Ollie fought for him and tried to stop it, but even he has bosses to answer to. Norman takes it well, although he's got to be dying inside. He basically just got fired, and he only has himself to blame. I'm not going to side with the firers in this case, though, not the firee. I'm saying this a lot lately, but even then, there were so many other choices. A lot of fish in the sea, guy. If you want to be this much of a pain in our behinds, sorry, we're buying you out. Goodbye. Although it's pretty gauche of Libby to be so visibly happy to drop the press release, where he says the main man is no longer part of their studio. The guy made your job harder, and I just admitted a minute ago that you have a right to be angry, but you're gleeful, Matthew? Well, then again, Norman did shove Matt back into a mirror in his drunken stupor earlier in the movie. It wasn't just that he was annoying. Sometimes he's violent. Vicky keeps getting bigger while her husband just hangs around the house, practicing his putting and playing solitaire. This is not a sad thing to me. If I could be this guy, I'd be this guy. And this nice big house, that I guess she's the only one paying for now, is right by the ocean. You can see through the window the way the waves crash onto the shore. When you know where the story's going, that's far more ominous than it is inviting. Vic comes home to enjoy a sandwich and a salad that he's prepared, Toothpick Vic, then decides she must, right this minute, break into song and show him a big number she's working on. It's a good production, but as so many songs do in movies like this, it goes on about 2 minutes too long. As unhappy as he is about where his career is, everything seems okay between them, until a delivery man doesn't recognize him, even calling him Mr. Lester. Plus it stings his pride even more that she's got all kinds of gigs lined up, and she's been nominated for an Oscar. And we're getting meta again because both of these actors were nominated for Oscars for this movie. It wasn't intentionally meta because they didn't know they were going to get nominated, but anyway. The night of the Academy Awards is the next scene. Norman isn't there with his wife when Vicky does win the trophy for Best Actress, which seems to genuinely shock her. All she can think about as she starts to head up on the stage is how she wishes her husband was there. But during her acceptance speech, Norman bursts in, drunker than we've seen him in the entire picture. His obnoxious applause from the back gets everyone's attention, but then he stumbles up on stage and, well, he doesn't even promise his wife, "I'm gonna let you finish." She never does get to finish her speech. He also doesn't pee himself the way Cooper does when Gaga wins a Grammy in their movie. But Norman does complain to everybody there, obviously the producers especially, about how they turn their backs on him, and he needs a job. He needs a gig. A gig, son. When you're in show business, a job is called a gig. Of course, the irony is that behaving like this is going to guarantee he won't get hired again. He doesn't mean to hit Vicky, but while gesturing big, he ends up backhanding her right in the mush, which she shrugs off. And of course, it basically apologized to him. "My face was in your way." She didn't say that, but that was the vibe she had. "Oh, why did I stand there?" I get wondering, by the way, why her stardom was not enough clout to get him a job in one of her movies. The answer is probably that the studio she works for is the one that fired him. Plus, word gets around. His movies weren't succeeding like they used to. And if you can't trust him to show up to work, then, well, loyalty's great, but that's a two-way street. If you sign on to a film, you have to at least try to be professional. And we're going to find out in a few minutes that he won't take a smaller role in a movie, doesn't want to, so she couldn't have necessarily employed him anyway. Anyway, we find out after the embarrassment at the Oscars that he's finally getting help. He's drying out in a sanitarium. Vicaroo, meanwhile, keeps on making elaborate musicals. Oliver visits her in her dressing room, and she confesses that even though she loves him as much as ever, her husband, not Oliver, she also hates him for failing to stay clean, and she hates herself for feeling that way. I know Judy Garland was acclaimed for the singing and the dancing, but she's pretty awesome breaking down like this in what is a very honest confession. To say to somebody that you hate the man you love is powerful stuff, and it made sense why she'd say that. But the former Esther, now Vicky, is such a pro that she wipes away the tears and goes right back out to shoot the next scene. They didn't even touch up her makeup, which they were in the middle of doing when Oliver walked in, and that was before she got all sobby. Had to sing, had to sing, had to sing. Oliver visits Norman in the sanitarium and does what he told Vicky that he would, offer the main man an acting gig. It's not a starring role, though, and Norman's pride won't let him settle for a character part. He lies to Mr. Niles about having all kinds of other gigs lined up. See, this is why it's smart of modern actors like Pitt and Damon to do so many cameos and nothing parts. If they ever have to settle for being a supporting actor because the powers that be won't let them be headlining stars anymore, it won't be as jarring to see them in smaller parts. They've already been in character parts 1,000 times in the past 20 years, in addition to their big-budget starring roles. A sober Norman runs into Libby at the racetrack, who digs on him for being a kept man. Norman accidentally backhanded Vicky at the Oscars. Well, now he deliberately backsmacks Matt for giving him all this lip, but he gets a big hard punch to the schnoob in return. The publicist drops the actor to the ground, and everybody who comes to help just assumes he's drunk, because that's what Norman does. If you're going to call him a whore, he might as well be one. He lives down to expectations, gets up, and orders a double scotch, which leads to a 4-day binge, and that, of course, drives Vicky out of her mind. Norman ends up getting arrested for being drunk and disorderly, even being thrown in a holding cell with a bunch of slovenly guys. He doesn't look as bad as he should, considering he's supposedly been guzzling for the past 4 days straight. The judge gives him a 90-day sentence in the county jail. The man in the robe recognizes Ernest Gubbins as a formerly famous actor and accuses him of wasting all the advantages he's had, so he's even harder on him because of that, not softer, because he was a star. Plus, he could have killed people driving around drunk. I agree with all of this, but I find it curious, too, because I've often seen portrayals of drinking and driving in the 50s as just boys will be boys. The opening of Far From Heaven, that's what they do, right, with Dennis Quaid. But not here. He's going to find out what normal people get for acting like this in public. He's more normal than he was when the movie started. Normal Maine. But the judgy one does let him off the hook after Vicky promises she'll take care of her husband and not let him out of her sight. Famous star or not, I can't believe the judge went for this. He just said that this guy can't be trusted not to be a public menace, and there's a little bit of a vendetta there going on, too. You're a big star, we're a big star, you're going to pay even more. It almost seems like he does that intentionally because he was a big star. Short of handcuffing herself to him, what is she going to do anyway? Anyway, money and fame talk, as it almost always does, and Ernie G is let out on bail. Ernest Gubbins. He wakes up after sleeping all the next day and overhears Vicky telling Oliver that she's going to give up her career to take care of her man. She feels like she owes him because she wouldn't even have this career if he didn't do all that he did for her. Fair, but give it all up? Can't you hire somebody to, I don't know, watch him? Handcuff him? Or just make him go back to rehab, which is obviously where he needs to go anyway? Oliver is reasonable, as he always is, but he's harsh in saying to Vicky that it's just over for Norman. There's nothing left. Well, of his career, yes, Oliver, but she doesn't care about him getting to act again. She just wants to save her husband from killing himself. When Cukor cuts back to Mason in the other room throughout this conversation, he does some of his best acting in the entire movie. He doesn't say a word, just listening to them with a horrified look on his face. He's obviously figuring out here that he needs to rid her of the burden of him, even though he has to know it'll crush her. Then Mason gets to do what Garland got to do not that long ago in the movie's runtime, have a crying scene. So he's playing a drunk, he cries, and he gets to play a death scene too? How did he not win the Oscar? Well, because others were better in other movies that year. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. Said death scene is when he walks into the crashing surf right outside their living room and never comes back out, just like Bruce Dern did in a movie I reviewed last year, Coming Home, and for some of the same reasons. But before he meets his watery fate, Norman puts on a happy face and tells Vicky that he's going to start swimming several times a day to get into shape. Plus he wants her to sing for him because it's a musical, and it's been a minute or two since she broke into a tune. But after getting one last look at her, he heads out to the beach and gets wet, and thus he truly becomes the man that got away. We know he did it on purpose, but the papers claim it was an accidental drowning. I wonder if anyone in his life actually believes that. I guess it's not impossible they would. People just drown in the ocean sometimes, whether they're impaired or not. And he was never suicidal before. They might have believed he walked out there all inebriated and couldn't find the undertow when he was so messed up. Although I guess Vicky could have set them straight because he wasn't drunk when he went into the water. She was there, she knows. Vicky's adoring fans and the jackals in the press swarm her at Norman's funeral, which seems to send her over the edge. One option for this story would be to have it be very dark and just have her mind break right here, and then she goes insane, literally, and never comes back from it. I know that they mourn big time in all the versions of this story, but every version of it has the woman recovering at least somewhat after the husband dies. And while Libby doesn't seem too broken up about any of this, Oliver is sad to say Matt might have known Norman, but he never really knew Norman. Vicky hides out at home, not making any more movies and avoiding everyone except Danny, who tough loves her about how much Norman loved her. Oh, and Danny says something in this scene that suggests they all know he did drown on purpose. I guess she needed to be told off in a nice way because she dusts herself off and shows up at the shrine for a charity function. And their symmetry, because that's where the couple first met. In fact, the heart they drew on the wall with their initials in it is still there. I like, by the way, he's always calling her Esther, and I think almost always, if not always, Oliver calls her that too, even though her name officially is Vicky. She's asked to say a few words, and what comes out through some tears is that AFI-nominated quote, "Hello, everybody. This is Mrs. Norman Maine." And that's enough to get everybody in the house to give her a standing O. And we're finally out. I didn't know going in this was the restored 3-hour cut. It says on the IMDb that it's 2 hours and 35 minutes, so I budgeted for that. 3 hours is about 45 minutes, too long. Cukor and the filmmakers were not happy, incidentally, that they had to cut the film down by about 25 minutes. But I really wonder if that version was a better film, the 2-hour, 35-minute version, that is. And interestingly, I said 40 minutes too long. The 1976 and the 2018 versions are about 40 minutes shorter than this lumbering epic is. The old one from 37, I think, is not even 2 hours long, by the way. So they get through their plot points a lot faster back then. Got through, I should say. So the cast. Judy Garland will always be associated with The Wizard of Oz, but the second flick of hers that most people will think about, well, maybe it's this, but I'd say it's more likely Meet Me in St. Louis. She played an Esther in this, and she played an Esther in that, too. Anyway, we've covered both Oz and St. Louis. This beloved cinema icon only lived to 47, dying of an overdose of barbiturates in the summer of 69. The summer of 69. So the moon landing happened in Woodstock, and one of the great stars of all time died. Frances Gumm was, of course, best known for the song and dance stuff, but ironically, her only 2 Oscar nominations were for more serious fare. In this, and in Judgment at Nuremberg. Okay, yeah, it's a musical here, but it's not light and fluffy. Some of the other hoofers she was in got a little dark, sure, but this is about alcoholism and suicide. Garland hadn't worked in a while before she made this. Her last movie before it was Summer Stock in 1950. So after working so steadily in the 30s and 40s, she only had 2 credits during the entire decade of the 50s. She wasn't in anything else for another 6 years. And while Judgment at Nuremberg wasn't the next one, it was the one after the next one. So that was 7 years after this. I don't know if Hollywood turned its back on her because of how much of an addict she was, or she just wanted to be a mom to Liza and her other kids and pulled back from show business. But we know that, in real life, she was more like Norman and his alcoholism than she was like rock-solid Vicky. In fact, making this, she missed her share of days off sick while making A Star is Born. Mason's character is the one who can't cope and messes up his own career. Garland often did that for real, so the 2 actors in reality were the complete opposite of each other in this movie. Of course, MGM deserves at least some of the blame for that, maybe even all of it. They hooked her on pills when she was still a kid. Or maybe that happened when she was a teenager. Well, to me, that's a kid. They would stuff her with pills to keep her up all day, working, and then downers to put her to sleep for a few hours. She had a great career. She accomplished a lot, had 3 kids, one of whom became a big star herself. And yet she's still somewhat the Mickey Mantle of Hollywood. What I mean is, she and Mantle were first ballot Hall of Famers, so to speak, but they could have accomplished so much more if their demons didn't overtake their lives. I don't know if Garland had a ton of range, the way that some of her peers and certainly modern actresses do now, but if you're going to be one of the best at musicals, then yeah, you're legend material. And she still is. She just could have been so much more. And if she does that framing the face gesture you see in a lot of the posters where her hands are up by her cheeks, I must have been looking down at my laptop because I didn't see it. One of the problems with taking thorough notes. James Mason was only 45 when this came out, yet here he is playing a sad has-been. I'm 50. I resent that. Well, I never really was, so I'm not offended. Okay, who cares? Anyway, Jimmy Mace was in 2 films we've previously reviewed, North by Northwest and The Verdict. As good as he is in those productions, and in this too, the man is actually best known for playing Humbert in Lolita and Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which came out the same year A Star is Born did. The Oscar nomination he got for this role was his first of 3, although this was the only time he was up for a leading actor Oscar. 1954 was a tough year. Brando won his first Oscar for On the Waterfront, and as new to movies as he was, Marlon was both overdue and he was fantastic as Terry Malloy. A lot of people think it's the greatest acting performance of all time. Bogey was great in The King Mutiny in 54 as well, although he had won only 3 years earlier for The African Queen, so he wasn't likely to take home another one so soon. In both cases, he's a ship captain. He's on the water. I don't know why I didn't think of that before. So as good as Mason is in this, I'm guessing he finished no better than 3rd in the voting, behind Brando and Bogart. It wasn't easy to get a star to do this part, so they settled for a very good actor who wasn't really a great big name like Brando or Sinatra or Bogart or Cary Grant were. Cukor really wanted Grant in particular, partly because they'd worked together a few times before, including on the Philadelphia Story. But Archie Leach turned him down. He would have been probably better casting. Mason's good, but yeah. We know that James Mason was Paul Newman's rival litigator in The Verdict, while Jack Carson was Paul Newman's brother in Cat in a Hot Tin Roof. Those are two of Newman's more underrated films, actually. Anyway, Carson got started in Hollywood in 1937 and was in something like a dozen films that year. Beyond Cat in a Hot Tin Roof, the other Jackie C. films we've covered, and he was not credited in either of them, are Bringing Up Baby and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I mentioned how often he played the grinning idiot in other motion pictures. Well, he's far from that here. In fact, I salute his work as Matt Libby. He does a commendable job of playing a mite bit of a jerk. Charles Bickford worked for about 35 years and ended up with over 100 credits in his filmography, but this marks his debut on our podcast. I thought we'd covered him before, but we haven't. A couple of his other flicks I might recommend, I will recommend, are the 1939 Burgess Meredith version of Mice and Men, 2 ofs in a row, and the 1947 Burt Lancaster prison movie, Brute Force. Tommy Noonan plays Danny. The poor guy in real life got a brain tumor and died not even a week before his 47th birthday. Didn't I say Garland was only 47 when she died? Well, that's a little eerie. Noonan did have a pretty long career, though. One of his roles was as a reporter in Adam's Rib, a film I covered about a year and a half ago, which was directed by George Cukor. He was nominated 5 times for Best Director, but only got his Oscar the last time he was nominated, when he won for My Fair Lady in 1964, 10 years after this. Where the devil is my Oscar? The Cukes also directed The Philadelphia Story, as I said, plus he was also one of many men who worked on Gone with the Wind. Those 4 motion pictures have been discussed on Have You Ever Seen at one time or another. I talked about the writer of this movie, Moss Hart, just this past winter when I reviewed You Can't Take It With You. He also got nominated for an Oscar for his Gentleman's Agreement script. That won Best Picture. Whether it really was the best film in 1947 or not, it wasn't. Hart based his A Star is Born script on the 1937 screenplay, which is something like 4 different writers, including that movie's director, William Wellman, and Dorothy Parker. Yes, her. Vicious Circle lady. Hart's script was also touched up by some big-name people, including, apparently, former studio head David Selznick, the driving force behind Gone with the Wind. And that's pretty typical. One person to be credited for a screenplay, but you hear about how even some of the great screenplays were touched up by 1, 2, 3, 4 people. Sidney Luft was the producer of A Star is Born. He was Judy Garland's 3rd husband and also her manager at the time. He only produced 3 films in total. I guess if Judy wasn't acting in a movie, he wasn't going to produce one. Sam Levitt shot the CinemaScope picture. Ray Heindorf came up with the music score, and Fulmer Blangstedt cut the film. Levitt won an Oscar for his black and white work on The Defiant Ones later in the 50s, which I reviewed nearly 2 years ago. You'll also find his name on things like Cape Fear and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, both of which we've also reviewed. Blangstedt cut Rio Bravo for Howard Hawks, we covered that. And Heindorf, well, he won 3 Oscars, one of which was for another musical, Yankee Doodle Dandy. He's also credited for being in the music department for projects like A Streetcar Named Desire and Strangers on a Train. Those 3 I just mentioned, Yankee Doodle, Strangers, and Streetcar, are in our archives. Okay, to start closing the book on this review, I didn't love the movie. I guess I said that a few times. I can't say it's not worth a thumb up. It's just a soft thumb up, very gently going the upward direction with your thumb. I was more touched by Cooper's version. Some of the best moments in that are still fresh in my brain. Nothing here comes close to what Cooper and Gaga did, I don't think. Well, maybe it comes close, but I think he did it better. Plus Brad's last scene. Brad! His last scene was Sam Elliott when he told old Sam, "You're my hero, wasn't Dad." That still kills me. I'd say this is the second best version of A Star is Born, at least. I'm never going to be the best person to review a musical, though, unless it's funny. I've said a few times over the years that if you're going to break in a song in such a phony way, most musicals are, well, this doesn't do that. I said that already, right? On the Town I did several months ago, that's one of those movies that everybody sings, and apropos of nothing. But that was funny, and if you're making me laugh, it was amusing. And if you're making me laugh, I'm going to be way more into it. Sing in the Rain, Wizard of Oz, Hairspray, they all do that. Still, if you're a super fan of this one, I hope I didn't disappoint you. I'm more of a respecter. I certainly admire how hard Judy and James worked. Although I have to quote what I said to Bev when it was finally over, that just kept going. So that was how I saw A Star is Born. Before we talk about what's coming up in the next few weeks on this channel, let's talk trivia. I've got 3 questions to tickle your brain. Here's number 1. Peter Cetera's hit song Glory of Love was featured in which 1986 sequel? Question number 2. Who plays the mother and who plays the father of all those kids in the 2003 mega hit Cheaper by the Dozen, which, like A Star is Born, is a remake? And question number 3. In 12 Angry Men, the defendant claims he couldn't have killed his father because he wasn't even home when dear old dad was murdered. What is his alibi? What did he say he was doing that night? Answers to those in a minute or 2. First, I need to tell you that the next time you get me on my own will be in 2 weeks. I'll be yammering on about the 1939 version of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the Charles Laughton one. In 3 days, though, it'll be Bev and me doing the talkie talk together. and we'll be covering one of the greatest comedies ever made, and also the greatest Star Trek movie ever made, one of my all-time favorite movies, Galaxy Quest. There's been a lot of tragedy and sadness in the movies we've been covering this month, and a lot of horror last month, of course. Not there. Galaxy Quest is pure joy. If you're eager to get in touch with us, you can type out an email. Our address is haveyoueverseenpodcast@gmail.com. Our Twix handles are @MovieFiend51 and @BevEllisEllis. Contact my fantastic wife on Threads using that same @. We'd love it if you would rate our show and write a review about it in your podcast app. Hit us with 5 stars, baby! Also, we post every show on YouTube. That's @HYESEllis in your web browser. Comment, like, and subscribe. And Sparkplug Coffee is waiting on you. They offer our listeners a 20% discount if they use our HYES promo code. Their website is sparkplug.coffee/HYES. As for the answers to those trivia questions, let's get to that. Number 1. Peter Cetera's hit song Glory of Love was featured in which 1986 sequel? That was The Karate Kid Part 2, which Chris and I reviewed on Scoring at the Movies. My other podcast is still out there in the ether, and that, by the way, is a very good song. Very singable. Question number 2. Who plays the mother and who plays the father of all those kids in the 2003 mega hit, Cheaper by the Dozen? Those kids include, by the way, Piper Perabo, who is becoming a bit of a star then, but didn't continue being a star. Tom Welling is another one, I think Hilary Duff. Anyway, the parents are Bonnie Hunt and Steve Martin. Now, there's a couple who should work together again, with good material next time. And question number 3. In 12 Angry Men, the defendant claims he couldn't have killed his father because he wasn't even home when dear old dad was murdered. What is his alibi? He was at the movies, baby! Attaboy. And now we'll put a bow on this sucker. Thanks so much for joining me today. Join us again on Monday for our gab about Galaxy Quest. Meantime, I think I'll go swimming. I'll just plan to come back in from the surf when I'm done. My wife can't get rid of me that easily. And cut.